Okay, if everybody would come in and get a seat, we'll try to get started.
Yes, sir. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to open up with the invocation. Our Father, who art in heaven, Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone for attending this event. It is great to see the public involved in government, no matter what the issue may be. We're glad to see people come. We like to see people come to our meetings and see what's going on. We want everyone to know that since we were first made aware of CO2 sequestration projects, the Allen Parish Police Jury has had concerns over public impact and public safety. We recognized very early on that the police jury was having to rely on information that came from people who directly benefit from these projects. So to be sure the jury and the public of Allen Parish was getting an unbiased opinion, the jury hired independent consultants, GEC and McNeese State University, to complete a risk assessment and economic analysis on CO2 sequestration projects on behalf of the parish. While we understand there's a lot of questions and controversies surrounding issues of CO2 related issues like eminent domain, global warming, and the state issuing Class 6 permits, this is not the meeting to debate those issues. Those issues are being debated at the state level as early as tomorrow morning, and we recommend that if you want to be heard on these issues by the people who make those decisions, please attend this year's legislative session. Instead, the purpose of this meeting is to provide an open forum where GEC and McNeese can present the results of their risk assessment and benefit study to the jury and public. And so the jury and public can ask and have their questions answered by a group of scientists who were contracted to represent Allen Parish, not industry or state of Louisiana. Again, thank you for coming, and I am going to turn the mic over to presentation moderator, Ms. Emily Welch.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Emily Welch. I'm a geologist with GEC, and I'm just going to go over real quick how the format of the meeting is going to go. We'll start with our presentations from GEC and McNeese, and then to go over the Q&A forms. All of those requesting questions to be answered, whether written or verbally asked, are required to fill out a public meeting question form. If you haven't already done that prior to the meeting, you can visit with the kind ladies in the entryway, and they can help you get that form filled out. The goals of the Q&A forms are to gain efficiency in the question asking and answering process, which will help avoid the meeting running well over the allotted time, to be sure that every person's question is documented and has the chance to be answered, to avoid the same questions being asked multiple times, and to allow people who may be afraid to ask a question in a public meeting setting the chance to have their question read aloud and answered, and also the ability to document any follow-up needed should a question be complex and need to be answered in more detail after the meeting. The question priority will begin with written questions. These questions will be asked out loud by myself to GEC or Dr. Groft. The order will be Allen Parish Police jurors, followed by Allen Parish residents, followed by out-of-parish residents. Next will be our verbal questions. I will call one individual at a time to the podium to ask your question. Question asking will be limited to 2 minutes. I will hold up this beautifully designed 30-second sign. Once I raise this, please wrap up the point to your question so that our experts up here can answer to the best of their ability. That order will be the same as our written questions. We'll begin with our Allen Parish Police jurors, followed by Allen Parish residents, followed up with out-of-parish residents. And at this time, I'm going to pass it over to the rest of our GEC team as they present the results of the environmental risk assessment on CO2 sequestration projects, the environmental and public health risk for Allen Parish, Louisiana.
Thanks, Emily. And good evening, and thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. And our goal tonight is to provide a technical summary of the report that we did. As we were introduced, we were hired by the parish last summer, and we prepared a report discussing the environmental and public health risk assessment aspects of CO2 sequestration, and specifically relative to projects that are being planned for the Allen Parish area. And that report was submitted to the parish in January, and so tonight we're just going to give you a quick summary of it. So go on to the next slide. So our project team, I just want to introduce you. My name is Mike Sims, and I have a PhD in geology and hydrogeology. Been working in the field for a little over 40 years, and have a lot of experience in subsurface geology of Louisiana. The next person on our team is Gary Snellgrove. He has a master's from McNeese State University in environmental science and many years of experience working in the regulatory area. Next on the list is Doyle Johnson, who's right next to me, sitting down here. Doyle's a petroleum engineer and has a professional engineering license in that area. Been working in that area for probably about 45 years or so. You know. And then lastly, Emily, who already talked to you, she's been working with us for about a year, and she's a geologist in training and has a good amount of experience. Really surprising amount for her age, in my opinion, just based on working with her. But she got her bachelor's degree from Mississippi State University. So what we want to do tonight is just kind of go through some of the major sections that we went through in the report. The report's fairly hefty in terms of number of pages and amount of information, and we understand that there's a lot of information in there, maybe difficult to read or take some time. And so the point is just to hit the high points tonight and kind of go through those. So we'll have some introductory and background information, and we'll talk about the geology of Allen Parish and how it relates to CO2 sequestration. And then a little bit on the permitting process and the regulations, that are developed for this. And those come from both the federal and the state level. And the risk evaluation process, just very cutting to the chase as to the most important issues, we believe. And then we'll talk a little bit about the projects that are in some stage of planning for Allen Parish, which are, as you know, a project that Oxy is looking at just to the northwest of Oberlin here, and then two particular projects that ExxonMobil is looking at, one kind of to the west and southwest of Oberlin, and the other to the southeast of Oberlin. So, go on to the next.
But just for information, that slide is difficult for the public to read.
Okay, well, I'll try to read everything and point to things, but thanks for that comment. Go on to the next one. Okay, so here we're just talking about what sequestration is. So I'll just basically read most of this. This is the long-term permanent storage of CO2 in geologic formations underground. Carbon dioxide, of course, you're familiar with. It's carbon and two oxygens. It's actually what we breathe out when we are breathing oxygen in and using oxygen for our metabolism. And animals and bacteria also exhale carbon dioxide as part of their life cycle. Further down here, if it's hard for y'all to read, I've just mentioned carbon capture is the idea of isolating CO2 from combustion of fuel or industrial processes, and keeping those emissions from going into the atmosphere. The whole idea is to limit the greenhouse gas effects of CO2. So this idea was really developed, back in the 1980s and 1990s as part of a, solution of what people are worried about with global warming. And, as we were discussed in the introduction, we're not here to discuss the details of the global warming ideas and all, but just to give you some background, that's where it's coming from. Lastly, at the bottom of this slide, I'm talking about the sources of CO2. So combustion of fuels, production of chemicals, processing of natural gas is another important way of getting CO2. A lot of natural gas has a lot of CO2 in it naturally. It's very, very common to find natural gas that has like 10%, even 20% or more CO2 in it. And that reduces the value of that natural gas for burning as an energy source. So typically what the oil industry does is they'll separate out that CO2. In the past, it would always just be discharged to the atmosphere. The idea now is, capture some of that and maybe sequester it underground so it doesn't just go in the atmosphere. Go on to the next. So this next picture is just a schematic showing potential sources, and then in the bottom, the underground area. So different kinds of plants that would be possible sources of CO2. And then underground, so the idea is you would separate out that CO2 from the industrial process and then pump it down a well over here on the right side, just showing the CO2 going down a well into some underground formation. There are different kinds of underground formations you could use. One of great interest is saline sand bodies underground, layers of sand. They're just occupied by saline water, deeper than groundwater. And Louisiana's got a lot of those. Once you get below where you have fresh groundwater, it's all salty water occupying the sand zones. And so these are called saline aquifers. And down here at the bottom of the slide is just indicating one of those. So if you go on to the next slide, here are the requirements that are looked at for doing sequestration. The first requirement is a depth that's adequate to have the pressure to keep CO2 in kind of a liquefied state, a compressed state. So that's about 2,600 feet underground to 3,000 feet. You'll see those kind of depths suggested. So it needs to be at least that deep. And then you want sand layers that have adequate storage volume, that have high porosity and that are very permeable, so that the CO2 can be injected in and there'd be a lot of volume down there for it to go. And then you want containment, capture by clay layers of low permeability that are above those sand zones. And then the reservoir having sufficient permeability so it can be injected. And then lastly, at the bottom here, I've written Louisiana geology is very favorable for sequestration generally when you look around the state. And so the whole Gulf Coast area actually has been a focus of interest for doing CO2 sequestration. Next slide. So here's just a conceptual picture of how the trapping underground would be. In the middle here is the reservoir, the sand zone, and up on top in the orange or yellow color is a seal or confining zone that overlies it, and another seal below it. And the formation has a dip off to the right where it dips downwards. And over on the right-hand side, there's a CO2 injection well that would be what you've heard of as called a Class 6 injection well. And so the CO2 would be injected into that, and then it would migrate up dip to the left, and the CO2 liquid material being a little bit buoyant, kind of has a similar to oil. So it's not as light, it's not as buoyant as a gas, but it's more buoyant than that salt water that's in the formation. So it's going to rise up into little traps, little folds or irregularities in the top. But also being indicated on here is that there's going to be a kind of a halo underneath it of residually trapped CO2 that's trapped between the sand grains and some CO2 that's dissolved into that water. Next slide shows what
Where
some
is
of
the groundwater in relation to that?
It'd be way shallower than this. So you'd be sequestering like at depths of about 3,000 feet or greater, and the groundwater zone generally goes to depths that are shallower than that. But we'll show specifically for Allen Parish what it is. So this picture, this picture is just showing an idea of what that residual trapping looks like. The picture over here shows sand where the light is in the sand grains look red, and there's pore space in between. Water shown up as green and CO2 shown up as black, as little pockets. And in a case like that residually trapped CO2 is not going to move. It's just held in place by the interfacial forces between the water and the CO2 between those sand grains. When you have more CO2, it'll actually fill up all of those pores, and that'll be the CO2 that could be mobile and be trying to move. Next slide. So the U.S. Department of Energy has done a number of surveys of the potential capacity for CO2 in the U.S. And generally, the places that have the highest capacity for storage are where you have thick packages of sedimentary formations. And the thickest are in the Gulf Coast, but there are also areas within the rest of the country where there are large accumulations of sedimentary rocks, like in the Appalachians, and then in the Illinois Basin, and up in the Rockies. Some of the mid-continent basins are very large accumulations of sediment. But really the biggest area is the Gulf Coast, going through specifically Texas, Louisiana, southern Arkansas, Mississippi, and a little bit into Alabama. So this is the area where the Department of Energy has said, we have the greatest storage capacity. We've discussed this in our report, and just based on the estimates we made in the report in comparison with this DOE stuff, I've made a note off to the side that just in Allen Parish alone, there's a sizable potential storage capacity. And of course, all the adjoining parishes have that too. The numbers that we came up with are generally in accordance with what Department of Energy came up with. And let's go on to the next slide. So, some interesting information is that over the last 30 or 40 years, there have been a number of pilot tests and test projects that have been done around the world. And this slide is showing a number of those in Europe and in the US and in the Far East and Australia. But even more important, I want to emphasize that there are some larger term projects that have been going on for a while. In Norway, there have been two significant projects. One, the Sleipner project, started in 1996 and has been running continuously since then. And it's at a storage rate of about a million tons of CO2 per year, which is kind of like what a lot of people are looking at in terms of potential project sizes. Another one that I want to point out that's very important is in Alberta, Canada. It's up here, it's called the Quest project. This is a project that Shell has been doing. It started in 2015, and it's been also about 1.2 million tons per year. So there have been some test cases, or more significant than tests, actual example projects that have been done. I think what's interesting about the Quest project in Canada is that's on land, and it's in an area of farms and ranches in Alberta, near the Canadian Rocky Mountains, but out in the plains to the east of there. And that project has a lot of very significant information. They've done a lot of monitoring. The Canadian government has had very strict regulations on that. So we have a quick summary of it in our report, but I would recommend that, if you're really interested in pursuing any of this, read about that Quest project. It's I think, an important case example for this. And go on to the next slide. Okay, so the objectives we had for our project were to evaluate and summarize the environmental and public health risks that would be associated with CO2 sequestration under the conditions of Allen Parish. And, the word risk gets used a lot in different ways, but when you look at like the safety community and how they look at risk, they're looking at it as a combination of the potential for something to happen, the probability of an event happening, and what the consequence is. So a high risk kind of an event is something that could happen frequently or have a very severe consequence. A low risk event would happen either more infrequently or have a smaller consequence with it. And so in the risk assessment world, they actually attempt to come up with numbers for the risk based on what they believe is the probability of something happening, like some kind of accident happening, and then, what the scenarios are for what kind of damage could occur. So when you look at the CO2 world, if you look at the hazards, the things that could affect people or the environment, really the major things are like if you had CO2 come up into this room right here and displace oxygen, the hazard would be asphyxiation. And it would all depend, on circumstances, like, if you opened the doors and had wind blowing through, that would be changing that. So obviously there are many different cases, different scenarios that can be looked at. When you look at the environmental risk, if you had CO2 coming up from the ground, before it even got into where we are right here, it'd be affecting the soil and groundwater underneath us, and would be basically making it acidified, lowering the pH. So those are like really the kind of hazards that are associated with that. But in addition, when you look at a CO2 project, you're looking at another kind of risk that occurs is a risk to the project's effectiveness. If the CO2 gets out of the ground, if it's been pumped underground to be stored long term, and if it gets out of the ground, not only is that potentially being a hazard to somebody, but it also lowers the effectiveness of the project. So that, let's say you're trying to store, 100 tons of CO2, and let's say 50 tons escaped, you'd be having a risk of, losing 50% of your CO2, basically losing 50% of your project's effectiveness.
They just get paid to recapture it again.
Well, yeah, I think if somebody was running a project like that, it would be not a very effective, use of their money. So I think they would be, that's actually been looked at in several projects where they felt that they, were not going to be able to capture effectively. And so that actually that became part of the economics. It was kind of a risk aspect for the economics. But what we're really concerned about is the hazards, to us,
So, hey, let me ask you something. So, if you're not able to capture it effectively, will you be able to contain it effectively?
Well,
Do you know that for a fact?
well,
No, you don't. You don't.
capture means taking it from that chemical process, like whether it's like capturing the CO2 that's being generated by combustion, to store it effectively is the other side, the underground side. And we'll talk about this more in a minute. But now when it comes to these risks of having the CO2 get out, when you look at a CO2 sequestration project, there are really kind of two sides to it. There's the containment underground, the subsurface storage zone containment risk. And that's it. Is it going to stay down there? That's that question. And then down here at the very bottom is the CO2 being brought to the sequestration site in a pipeline, being transported in, and having surface facilities, like pumping stations and things like that. So there's the containment out of those too. So in our report, we look at both of these and we go through a description of various types of risks that are associated with each of these. So let's go on to the next slide. So at this point, I just want to give a real quick summary of Allen Parish geology, and this will play into what we're talking about and what you were just asking about in terms of containment type issues. I'll show you a cross section in a minute, but there are a number of formations under Allen Parish and adjoining parishes that consist of a lot of sand and with a lot of porosity and storage capacity. So these would be the Miocene formations, the Frio, the Cockfield, and the Wilcox. After that, you're getting pretty deep. But you're looking at a total thickness of about 8,000 to 11,000 feet as a potential storage area. There are numerous clay zones in between that would be confining zones. The geologic structure is very simple, just the formations deepen to the south and thicken to the south, and we'll show that in the cross-section. And there's been a huge amount of drilling for oil and gas since about 1920 here. I think there are 1,000 wells that have been drilled for the oil industry in Allen Parish alone. And then another thing of interest to people wanting to do CO2 is the source of CO2. There's a lot of industry to the south of here, you know, in Lake Charles and all. And then in addition, Exxon has a CO2 pipeline that actually goes through the southern part of the parish. And we'll just go look at the next slide real quick. This is a map of the U.S. just showing some of the major CO2 pipelines. And Exxon has this pipeline that comes from central Mississippi, from the Jackson Dome area, where they actually get CO2 that's naturally accumulated underground. And then they pipe it eventually to Texas. And that pipeline actually goes just through the southeastern corner of Allen Parish. That's the old Denbury Green Pipeline you may have heard of. We can go on to the next slide. I'll just show a more detailed map. So here's the boundaries of Allen Parish coming around here. This is a map of pipelines, including in blue, natural gas pipelines, but in red is this CO2 pipeline that is regulated as a hazardous liquids pipeline. And so that just kind of comes through like right around Elton and then angles off to the southwest and then eventually goes on to Texas. Kind of follows I-10 once it gets down to around the Lake Charles area. So let's go on and look at the geology, but that's just, you know, where somebody might get some CO2. So here's a map of Allen Parish. Emily worked up a cross section, and they go from the north to the south. And just indicated on here are oil wells that we used the logs from to draw this cross section. So let's take a look at the next slide. So it's really relatively simple. North is on the left, south is on the right. And what it's showing, you just see these different layers that are sloping down from left to right, sloping southerly. So the formations are dipping to the south. And we'll look at a couple of cross sections that'll show more detail, but in Allen Parish, there's about 30,000 feet of sedimentary formations before you get into hard rock at depth. And we're just looking in this cross section down to about 15,000 feet. So just about the upper half of that. But when you go deeper, it's really just too deep. I don't know, some of y'all may have worked in the oil industry, maybe some of the oil field service, drilling, whatever, any of y'all. But you would know that, you know, there aren't that many wells here in Louisiana that go into that really, really deep section. So let's go on to the next slide. So first of all, up at the top are the freshwater aquifers. And y'all have heard of the Chico aquifer. The Chico is the shallowest. Yeah, thanks. It's up here, just this little layer that's thickening to the south. It's about 100 to 300 feet thick. And in the northern part of the parish, it's basically right at the ground surface. But by the time you get to the southern part of the parish, the bottom of it is about 400 feet below ground. And, you know, the Chico aquifer is really the source of most of the fresh water in the parish, and really all through southwest Louisiana. So I guess back about almost 40 years ago, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency designated it as a sole source aquifer. And a sole source aquifer is just a water supply aquifer supplies at least 50% of the drinking water. And here in Allen Parish, it's actually, much more than that. All of the domestic wells outside of the towns are in the Chico Aquifer. Really, virtually all of the rice irrigation wells also are in the Chico Aquifer. And all total, I think the Chico Aquifer produces about 21 million gallons of water per day, fresh water. So now the towns mostly use the next aquifer down, which is the Evangeline Aquifer. And so that's up here. So it's pretty thick aquifer. It's about 1,800 feet thick or so. And it also dips southward. And so you can see it getting deeper as you go to the south. And you really get to a point where the base of freshwater is within the lower part of the Evangeline when you're in the very southern part of the parish. So the towns basically use the Evangeline Aquifer, and just because it's a little more protected from any kind of surface contamination or so on, it was a decision that was made really probably 50 or 60 years ago to shift the towns from the Chico to the Evangeline Aquifer. Then lastly, another aquifer that you may have heard of here that's deeper is called the Jasper Aquifer. And I really only found one water supply well that was in it, and that was for the town of Reeves. And it's just really in the very upper part of the Jasper Aquifer. So let's go on to the next slide. So this slide, and we talked about this more in the report, we're just showing the depth of the base of the underground source of drinking water, the overall thickness of the freshwater zone. And so up in the northwestern part of the parish, that's about 3,400 feet down. And in the southeastern part of the parish, it gets shallower, and so it's about 2,400 or 2,300 feet down to the base of the freshwater. So any ideas about sequestration are going to have to be below this underground source of drinking water. This is protected by the regulations. You can't inject CO2 into this, and you have to monitor and design your project so you're not having CO2 get into the USDW, the underground source of drinking water. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So getting into deeper formations, I mentioned the Miocene. So the Miocene actually extends up dip into the USDW zone. So in Allen Parish, it's not suitable for doing CO2 sequestration. It's got a lot of thick reservoir sands. Farther south, it's of interest to projects looking at CO2 sequestration. And there are a number of projects south of I-10 that are looking at the Miocene as a potential zone for that. But this is a thick interval. It's running in the southern part of the parish. It's, the base of the Miocene is way down here at about 6,000 feet down. So it's quite a thick formation. Well, let's go on to the next one. So the sands that are being looked at for CO2 sequestration are deeper than the Miocene. It's specifically the Frio Formation, and that's what has been looked at by both Oxy and by ExxonMobil. And so the Frio Formation is quite a thick formation. Up in the northern part of the parish, it's at about 4,000 feet, but by the time you get to the southern part of the parish, it's about 6,500 or 6,700 feet to the top of the Frio. So the depths are all within the kind of range that you would consider for CO2 sequestration. It's capped by a formation called the Anahuac, which is it's actually an Aztec name. It was used in Texas. So the Anahuac is this clay formation that overlies it, and it's considered to be the seal. The Frio is underlain by a very thick sequence of play, the Vicksburg and Jackson groups. And so when you look at it from a sequestration standpoint, you say, okay, here's a reservoir that's confined by plays above and below. Let's go on to the next one. Another formation that was of interest is even deeper, and that was the target for the Denbury project that was looked at for Vernon Parish, just to the northwest of the northwest corner of Allen Parish. And the Wilcox is a really deep formation. It's about 4,000 feet thick. And you don't get to the top of it until you're down at like 8,500 feet to 12,000 feet in the southern part of the parish. So quite deep. And let's go on to the next. So at this point, I want to turn over the discussion to Gary Snellgrove, one of our co-authors. And Gary's looked at the regulatory aspects, so he's going to give a quick summary of that.
Thank you, Mike. Gary Snellgrove here, and I have worked on the GEC project to evaluate, discuss the permitting process for Class 6 wells, which will be the type of well that is utilized for CO2 sequestration projects. So when we talk about the law a little bit and the authority for Class 6 permitting, which the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was authorized by the Safe Drinking Water Act to develop an underground injection control program. And so under that program, this is where the Class 6 wells fall under. And the EPA, through review and evaluation and their own research and teaming up with industry as well as research organizations, completed their final rule for the Class 6 injection, CO2 sequestration injection wells in January of 2011. And following that, the Louisiana Department of Louisiana Department of Energy and Natural Resources, the Office of Conservation, this is the agency in Louisiana, which I'm sure you're aware of now, having gone through a lot of these educational meetings. But this is the agency in Louisiana that regulates Class 6 wells. So the EPA here recently in 2023 provided the state of Louisiana's Office of Conservation primacy for the underground injection control program to regulate as a state the injection of CO2 for Class 6 wells. Next, please. So in this slide, I really just want to give a brief summary, a very brief summary and an overview of the permitting and the regulatory process. And I do mean very brief because the report goes into great detail about the specific rules and regulations both through the EPA process as well as Louisiana's Office of Conservation UIC program and their primacy for Class 6. But the takeaway here is that these rules and this permitting process is established on a project-specific approach. And in that approach, the key takeaway is that the process will define and establish unique risks of CO2. And some of these unique risks for CO2 sequestration include, again, as identified by the EPA in its process, that these projects are going to have large injection volumes. CO2 is buoyant, as Mike mentioned earlier, and it is mobile. And it is also corrosive when in contact with water. And so these rules that were established both by the EPA and then subsequently by the Office of Conservation or designed to mitigate these risks. And in doing so, standards were created that governed the geologic site characterization, area of review, and corrective action for any types of penetrations that may show up inside of a CO2 plume area of review. And I'll hit the monitoring and testing requirements throughout the project and post-injection. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail next slide. So, yeah, so here, the most important point that I want to make is that the rules are set up for Office of Conservation to be an interactive process. So it's not the type of regulation where you have a very static standard, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to do it, and 5 and 10 years from now, you're going to be still doing that same thing to make that compliance. These rules were established to be a very fluid and dynamic process, one of which is based on establishing a minimum set of standards and complying with those minimum set of standards. Project gets implemented, and during that process, there's going to be monitoring and testing and evaluation and reporting to the agency all of this data and information about the project's operations. And the rules include timelines and actions that will take place over a certain intervals of time to reevaluate the permit, basically, and the operations, whereby the operator that's got the permit and the agency reviewing the project will come to some conclusion that things are going well, we continue to do what we're doing, or we're seeing some aspects of the project that require some additional monitoring and testing, may require to do things a little different. It may require a different type of technology to determine more specifically where the plume is going or how it's reacting in the subsurface.
That's after all the damage is done to the public.
That's it. Oops.
So the process, again, is interactive, and it's a monitoring situation that will prevent and mitigate prior to it becoming a problem to the public. That's the objective of the rules and the regulations. That's why there's so much emphasis on the monitoring and testing and the revisiting over time of the conditions that are out there. Next, please. So, again, the project is evaluated through a site-specific process that includes a stratigraphic well and site-specific geology established, and then the Class 6 permit is reviewed based on this site-specific geological information, subsurface information, to design a project that will be protective of the environment, the USDW, as Mike mentioned earlier, your groundwater, as well as the atmosphere once the project has been permitted. And then during and up to 50 years, at least 50 years post-injection, the monitoring will continue for the storage zone where the CO2 plume and the pressure front exist, the confining zone that Mike mentioned earlier, the confining clays, assuring that these sealing confining zones are maintained. The USDW will continue to be monitored and evaluated, as well as groundwater and air, well integrity, the well itself and its operations, and post-operations integrity will be evaluated. And of course, there will also be in the rules emergency shutdown and emergency response and mitigation actions that will be included as part of their plan.
So, do we have a DEQ right now? And if we do, what department, do we even have any department to monitor these rules, or that rules just gonna be?
Yeah, the governing agency is the Louisiana Office of Conservation. And they're the permitting authority in
Yeah,
Louisiana.
but they undermanned right now. They have new people in there every other month. I deal with them on a monthly basis. So they don't even know what the hell's going on, sir.
And you can't,
Well, that's who your governing agency is, and that's who's set up in the state to evaluate these projects. And
Biden was a governing agency also, sir.
and you can't monitor this until you put it in the ground and find out that it has moved. And then you're gonna say, oops, how you gonna fix it?
And also, so if we're looking at the 5,000 to 17,000 feet range is what y'all said, correct?
Well,
The wells that are being proposed right now are down in the
They're not,
Frio.
sir, they're not being, okay, I know, I'm not trying to be ugly. They're not being proposed, they're already working on the sites, right? Am I
Well,
correct about that?
No,
Where's our police jurymen in here? Are they working on the sites, yes or no?
well, that's
Yes
for
or no?
the Class 5 stratigraphic test well, so not the actual injection.
So 5,000 to 17,000 feet, is that what you said a while ago?
No, I was talking about the Frio being around
So what-
5,000 to 7,000.
Okay, so what are they pumping in?
Please hold all questions and comments until the end in the Q&A portion.
Yeah.
Everybody will have the opportunity, I promise, to address, ask questions. If we can let the guys get through their presentations, the floor will be open to the public.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to address these issues, and this is really kind of what we're getting right to with this next slide. So we have a section of the report called risk evaluation, which follows the section describing the regulations, and the regulatory section goes into a lot of detail. But for risk evaluation, remember that I talked before about the subsurface containment risk as one group of risks, where, risk being, the chance of something moving up and then what that consequence would be. And then separately, down here in the bottom, the project operations, the pipelines, the pumping stations, the wellheads, and so on. And so when you look at the subsurface containment risk, in general, when you look at projects, around the world and ones that have been evaluated, the kind of questions that come up is the CO2 going to leak through the confining zone that's above it? Because it's buoyant, so it's going to be trying to float upwards. So are there permeable pathways through the confining zone, which is a clay zone? Could there be leakage along faults, is another general question. Could there be pressurization as a result of the injection of CO2? Just like any injection well is associated with buildup of pressure. And the less permeable the formation that it's being injected into, the more pressure buildup there is, because it's hard to push the water. If it's very permeable, there's less pressure buildup. Whatever you're injecting just kind of goes out. That's the principle of produced water injection wells. They're used in the oil field where, they recover oil that's mixed in with formation water. They separate it out in separators on the surface, re-inject that produced water to maintain pressure in the reservoir, for one, very often.
Did the
So-
risk assessment address overpressuring of the injection zone to the point of fracture?
Well,
In other words,
yeah,
creating
that's
enough
that's one of the questions that comes up from that.
But
Now,
Did
lastly,
your risk report, your risk assessment, did it cover that?
well, we mention it let me say one other thing about risk assessment. When you're doing an actual quantitative risk assessment for a particular project, there's a lot of details you need to know about that project, like where the well's going to be, what the injection rates are going to be, what the actual properties of the formation and all that. And that's part of the actual Class 6 permitting process that is done by the applicant. One of the things we said in this report is we do not have those type of detailed pieces of information about the projects that are being proposed because they're in an early stage of development. What we were trying to do in this report is describe the general types of risks and sort them out based on what the geology of Allen Parish is and the nature of the type of projects being planned. So,
Is that the part where you said that that information is proprietary and confidential to the corporations?
well, yeah, at this time, because those permit applications, either like in the case of Oxy, they've been submitted to the state, but they're proprietary. In the case of Exxon, they haven't been done yet.
Yes, so we never get all of the true information.
Let me get on through all this, okay?
Hey,
I mean, I appreciate
wait. This gentleman's paying more taxes than all y'all combined. He has a right to speak.
No, I totally agree, but let me
You will be allowed to speak.
yeah,
I promise.
let me get through this information so we can move on to the
Please
questions.
continue.
Okay, thank you. And then the last item I listed here in terms of the subsurface risk of release is leakage from wells. Like, we were telling you that there were 1,000 oil wells that have been drilled in Allen Parish. Most of those are plugged and abandoned. There aren't that many operating wells now. There are a number of shut-in wells, and there's some orphan wells, that were shut in, and the companies that were running them, didn't have the money to plug and abandon them. But those, even the plugged and abandoned ones, are potentially a pathway that goes down through the zone where the storage of CO2 would take place. So that's another question, are those potential pathways? And then when you look at the surface operations, you got pipelines, pumping stations, the injection wellheads on the surface. So from the conditions in Allen Parish, we believe that the most critical subsurface risk is leakage from old wells. And it all depends on where a project is located. If a project's located in an area that has very little drilling, like much of the northern part of Allen Parish and the western part, there aren't many, or in some cases, you can go several sections of property and not run into any old wells. In other parts of the parish, there are, a large number of wells. I'll show you a map of the wells just based on what the state has, and you'll see that there is a big difference from one side of the parish to the other. But when it comes to the surface operations, and you look at history of pipeline releases, we believe that there are risks associated with the surface facilities, and that those have to be managed by the regulations for pipeline safety and pumping station safety and so on. So let's go on to the next slide. So one way of representing these risks is through a risk matrix. And what's being shown here is running from extremely rare, very low frequency events outward to something that would be expected or higher frequency. And then vertically going with a road consequence here. So, minimal or no impact up to higher impacts. And those can be divided up into whether those are risk to public safety or effects on the environment or so on. So when you think about it, a higher impact and a higher frequency takes you out into this corner of the diagram, which are basically higher risks. If there's very low consequence and very low frequency, it's down in this lower left portion which is low risk. So the goal of a risk assessment that's done for us specifically for a project, when you have all the information involved, is to quantitatively map out what the risks are for each kind of event. But in general, for the subsurface releases, you know, the conditions of Allen Parish in terms of the confining zones, the lack of faulting, the high permeability of the injection zones and so on, really put us in a position where we would just say that if the plume got to an old abandoned well, we believe that you could definitely have, you know, it'd either be possible or likely, or even very likely, to have CO2 come up that well. Might take a few years or whatever. And so the question is, when you look at the wells, is where are the wells relative to where the CO2 is going to be injected, and so on. You can look at this the same way with pipelines. You know, if you know, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go on to the next slide. So when it comes to the wells, maybe you could move this over a little bit. No, that's good. It's good enough. We classified the wells into groups based on where they would be relative to the sequestration zone and the plume. So well type 1 would be a well that actually, this is an old abandoned well, that actually goes through where the CO2 plume would be. So that'd be, you know, kind of the highest risk situation. Type 2 over here would be still within the area of pressure buildup within the sequestration zone. Now the other wells that are shown on here have lower risk. These would be, you know, wells that just go into the confining zone or just go to the base of the USDW or so on. And these would be wells that would not be impacted by the CO2. So one of the things we want to emphasize here is the importance of identifying and actually finding old wells relative to a CO2 project that's being planned. And so if you look at where, you know, wells are known to have occurred, and then, you know, actually confirm that those are the only wells that are there are a number of techniques for doing that. That would allow you to say, yep, we got, you know, 5 wells within the area of the plume, and then the regulations focus on remediating or correcting those wells by re-entering them and setting plugs that are going to be resistant to CO2. In the current condition that an old abandoned well is in, CO2, if it's like, especially like this type 1 type well, CO2 is likely to eat its way into that well, corrode the casing, actually corrode the cement also. CO2 could react with an old cement that was put in the past that's not resistant to CO2, and eventually that CO2 would work its way up. Now, what would the consequence be? It could be that the CO2 would just work its way up into the next sand zone above the sequestration zone, you know, maybe above the confining zone, and then spread out a little bit in there.
That's funny, buddy.
Stop right there. That's as far as it goes. It stops right there. It just eats its way up through there and it stops.
Well, it's going to be different for different cases, but the critical thing is beforehand doing the remediation on that well, so it's not a pathway.
It eats up the concrete, the cement, and the pipe, and it stops when it gets up 20, 30 more feet.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide.
That's what we need to do.
Okay, now so for pipelines, and we have quite a bit of discussion of this in the report. You know, there's been a lot of study of pipeline risk that's been done for natural gas pipelines as well as CO2 pipelines. And so they kind of break out the types of events, accident type events that can happen. You know, there's operator error. Third-party incidents really are about the highest frequency. That's like when somebody decides to dig a big hole and they haven't checked to see if there's a utility in that area. They haven't done a utility check, you know, an 811 call or whatever, and they're digging away and they hit a pipeline. And these kind of things happen. And then there's corrosion-induced failure, which is more common on you know, older pipelines that are not made of, you know, some of the high-quality steels that are used, like especially in CO2 pipelines, but still can happen. There's equipment failure of various kinds that can happen, design flaws, and natural disasters. And like, for example, the Sequestration, Mississippi CO2 pipeline failure was a natural disaster. That pipeline was running along a highway at the top of a really steep hill. And if you've ever been to Mississippi and the area around Vicksburg and so on, you know how steep the hills are, the bluffs going down to the Mississippi River, the steep valleys. This highway was running right along the top of one of those steep slopes, pipeline right next to it, and a big landslide occurred and took out the pipeline. So the ground just fell away and the pipeline broke and CO2 came out. So that was an example of this type of natural disaster. You know, just, I guess it was last year, there was a pipeline equipment failure at a pumping station near Lake Charles on a CO2 pipeline. So that was kind of in the equipment failure, maybe design flaw type range of things. You know, we know from those kind of things that surface equipment can have failures, and the real critical thing here is the regulatory environment to make sure that if there is a release from a pipeline, that it's limited, that monitoring takes place, that can detect it, and they can get under control quickly. In populated areas, automatic shutoff valves are required to be 15 miles apart on pipelines. You know, we think that it would probably be prudent to have even shorter intervals, you know, especially when you're in the vicinity of a populated area or so on. And there's some discussion of that in the report. Let's go on to the next slide. So I just want to give you a real quick summary of these projects that are being talked about. The Oxy project, they call it the Magnolia project. That's in a large tract of land that's just to the northwest of Oberlin. And it overlaps the West Bay Wildlife Management Area. And they submitted 2 Class 6 permit applications for CO2 injection wells in 2021 that are under some stage of review by the Department of Energy and Natural Resources. Because they're the ones who have, as Gary said, Office of Conservation, which is part of that agency. They drilled a Class 5 stratigraphic test well in 2022. It's just north of Highway 26, just a little bit west of the Calcasieu River. They're looking at the lower Frio formations. The depth's like around 6,000 feet. They'd like to have 2 wells, and that's why they did the 2 permit applications. And each one have 2 million tons of CO2 per year be injected into it. As of when we talked to them, the CO2 source was not established for that project. We don't know what the current situation is. ExxonMobil is looking at 2 different areas. One is the Hummingbird project, they're calling it, and that's kind of west and southwest of Oberlin, just south of the Oxy lease. And the Mockingbird project is southeast of Oberlin, kind of goes across 26, in the area north of Elton. And they've leased up a bunch of acreage there. And currently they have 2 Class 5 test well permit applications submitted. And two days from now, Wednesday night, there's going to be a state hearing on those 2 wells here in this same room. Their plan is also for the Frio formation. They have not, to our knowledge, developed the permit applications for the actual injection wells. So we don't know the details of these projects, like in terms of how much they want to inject or exactly where the injection wells are going to be. But from discussion with them, they're certainly trying to avoid areas that have old abandoned wells. And they also have said that if they do have an old abandoned well nearby, they would re-enter it and plug it. So the last slide, I just want to, well, actually next to the last slide, just want to show these locations. So the Oxy project in green up here. So Oberlin is right here at the intersection of Highway 26 and US 165. And the blue areas are the ExxonMobil projects, and these are just sort of outer envelopes of the areas they've leased. They're actual lease position acreages or a lot of patches of land within these broad outlines of these blue lines. And these may have changed since the time, you know, we got this particular lease information last August, and we don't know how much additional land they have leased. But these two projects, as I was saying, one's west of Oberlin and the other southeast of Oberlin. So last slide. Well, actually there's one more, but let's just talk about this briefly. This is the slide that shows the old wells, oil wells in Allen Parish. So Allen Parish, the northern end's up here. Elizabeth is about here. Reeves is down in here somewhere. Oh, here it is. And then the southern boundary of Allen Parish goes across. Oberlin is right in this big cluster of wells. There was the old Oberlin field and South Oberlin field, which were discovered back in the 1940s and produced for many years. The Oxy project I've just indicated here is in an area where you notice there aren't too many wells. I think within their lease there's actually only maybe about 12 old wells that are in there. The Exxon projects would be in this area and down here. And as the Exxon people pointed out, there are some gaps in there where there aren't old wells, and they're kind of interested in those areas. So when you look across here just west of Oberlin, there's some areas that are pretty open, going for several miles without wells. And down here, north of Elton, there's also some areas like that. So last slide. In conclusion, we believe the principal risks are containment leakage from old wells, specifically those ones that are in the area of the plume and the elevated pressure area around it. That's called the area of review, or AOR in the regulatory language, and releases from surface facilities. And that to minimize the risk, corrective action for the wells has to be done. And that's an operation where they actually find the well, re-enter it, install a CO2 resistant plug. So it's a drilling operation. And then pipeline safety and surface facilities requirements may have been associated with, like, for example, the Satartia project in Mississippi. So
would you consider adding overpressure of the injection zone to that? Because that is a concern, but it doesn't stand out in the report enough for you to make it a line item, if you'd consider that, please. Thank you.
I appreciate that comment. Yeah, we can develop that concept a little bit more and give a little more description. Really, for Allen Parish, I don't see it as being an issue because these sand zones have such high permeability. But in some other projects around the world, they did have some pressure buildup where they were injecting into some actual hard rock, as opposed to sand. But let's move on. Dr. Groft from McNeese is going to give a presentation on the economics. And so we need to move on to that, and then we can go on to questions. really appreciate your
Where's the
attention.
assessment of risk? The information you provided was something we could find on Google in about 3 hours. There's no assessment of risk in here.
Well, it really depends on how you define risk assessment. We can talk about that a little bit more, but
I thought that's why we were here to talk about
Yeah.
the risk.
but there's qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So our goal was to break out all the different sources of risk, describe those, and not say the risk is going to be 1 in 10,000 for this or 1 in 20,000 for this, because that requires very site-specific information that's about the projects, and that's really something that the applications are going to have.
What was the depth? What was the depth of the proposed wells? You said.
The wells for the Frio formation are around 6,000 feet.
Okay. So right here in Moss Lake, good friend Mr. Charlie Vincent, for Public Services, which operates the Jeff Davis landfill, they have wells at that depth also that they've been pumping in, right? Correct? And so if you're more than welcome to look it up yourself, but they said it posed no threat to the people around the area. And now Republic has had to buy that whole neighborhood out down there. And they said it was supposed to, be on the east side of 27 there. Now it's encroaching Mr. Charles Vincent's land on the opposite side. And so, Exxon themselves, you can look up, I think they're number 2. They're ranking as far as trying to drill the deepest hole, correct? Besides Deepwater Horizon, and yet that didn't fare out too well for them. So there's a lot of holes in there, right? And we really don't believe your assessment, right? So anyway, let's go on with the rest of it. We'll see what the economics has to say about it, right?
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Hold on. Let's see if they can fix this. While they're getting it fixed, my name's Dan Groff. I'm an associate professor of economics at McNeese State University. I'm also the director of the Drew Center for Business and Economic Analysis. I was asked to estimate the economic impacts of a carbon capture project, basically, right? And I was asked to sort of keep my presentation a little bit shorter. I'm going to hurry up. If I'm blocking you, just let me know. I like to sort of walk around and point out. These are economic impacts, right? Like, what are the economics behind it? Well, jobs, incomes, the amount of output that you can get from a project, right? So we kind of, when you think about economic impact, you break it into 2 parts. The first part is construction. You have to build it, get your materials, put it together, and that's temporary. That's like a one-time injection into your economy, right? After that, it's the operations of the project. These are going to continue on and on and on. I was sort of driving here and I saw Kushada and they're building that big thing, right? Well, after that's built, all those workers are either going to go back to build something else, they might leave the area, and then the operations are going to continue on for a long time. So when we were doing the economic impact, you had to credit to one of the companies, Oxy. They gave us sort of some info on what we can expect in terms of jobs. Everything is very new, everything's sort of up in the air, but they did provide us with this. Actually, can you sort of tilt that down a little bit? There we go. Or what that? Yeah.
Do you believe those first 2 numbers in the first 2 rows of Exxon and Oxy?
Say that one more time, sir.
Do you believe that?
Do I believe that? Let me explain it and I'll tell you where I got it. Okay?
The Q&A portion will also include questions to Dr. Groff.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to it. I'll be very quick. Okay, so these are the full economic impacts. These include direct effects like what's hired. So they told me it would take about 44 construction workers the first year, 191 construction workers the second year. We modeled this using economic impact software because there's all these linkages throughout the economy, right? If once construction workers get their money, they're going to have to, spend money locally at restaurants, buy groceries, buy food, and these are all the economic impacts. So, so that's what the model says, and this is all Allen Parish. And then after that are the operations of about, we were told about 7 jobs. So those 7 jobs, and that would create about 2 new spin-off jobs. So you'll notice that those first 2 years, that's the construction. That's just the one-time temporary injection. But over time, these are just sequestration wells. They're going to need some monitoring, some engineering services, and so that's a much smaller amount. Now, I always say these can be scaled up or scaled down. This is just one project. If you
They're building the gallows that's going to hang themselves.
So if there's 2 projects, you would double these. If there's 3 projects, you would triple these, depending on the amount of workers. This is just an illustration. So over time, most of your impacts right now in terms of economy, in terms of jobs and income, are just coming from the construction phase. After that, it's very small over time. Okay? Oh, actually, leave it on there. Leave it on there 1 second. There is one thing I want to point out. We did not consider lease payments. Sometimes you'll hear these things talked about lease payments, but the lease payments were confidential. But also you have to ask yourself, who are these lease payments going to? Are they going to local landowners who live here? Are they going to businesses that are out of state? Are they going to people who aren't going to spend a lot of money, right? So in order to have an impact on the economy, those lease payments have to go to, in the local economy, have to be given to local people who are going to spend a lot of it to have an impact. But if it's going to people or entities that aren't going to spend a lot of money, well, it's not going to have much of an impact. So it was confidential, we didn't have the data, and we did not include that. Okay, you can move on now. These fiscal impacts are extremely uncertain because there are different ways to calculate them, right? One way is we just use the economic impact modeling way in order to do it. And another way is that we use Jim Richardson's ratio of the amount of economic activity to local tax collections. And once again, most of the local and state and federal comes from the construction phase, right? So we use that, and those are the amounts over time. And these aren't present value. We try to be as conservative as possible. And once again, these can be scaled up or scaled down. This is just for an example project. Okay, you can go to the next one. All right. Now those previous impacts, so now we're all in uncertain terms, right? The previous impacts are based on the economic activity and labor income with the project, right? Property taxes are a little more uncertain. We only received inputs of jobs, so we calculated based on that. Property taxes could be a significant portion. It depends on equipment and structure set up on the project location. So since the report, I received one piece of information related to property taxes. So here is a new pipeline where a portion of it goes through Allen Parish. Can you go to the next one? So the slide that I received said it could be about, 16, and it could be about 25 miles in Allen Parish, or it could be as big as 20 to 24. So if I take your property tax estimates and I estimate this over 27 years with depreciation, you're getting about 7.1 million to 14 million. Now remember, this is over 27 years, right? So whenever you're hearing these numbers about how much is going to come in, you always want to ask over what time period, right? So it's not a huge amount. There are some things to worry about, like maybe more detailed millage rates. You might have higher property tax rates in more rural areas. And this is just using the parish average. Okay, continue.
So our taxes are gonna go up. property taxes are gonna go up?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying millage rates can change over time. They may go down.
They'll have to go down because it's not gonna be worth it. You can't subdivide over these
Well,
properties.
Yeah,
When they go out, you can't,
Yeah.
you know. you
I'm
can't
just
do
saying
anything.
millage rates
Our
can change
kids
over
can't
time,
build on it.
right?
Please hold all questions.
Yeah,
and comments
yeah,
to the
yeah.
There's
committee.
much
Hey, hold it,
uncertainty
don't-
regarding fiscal impacts to the parish, right? We have to figure out how much sales tax will be collected on materials purchased. But once again, that's a quick construction injection. Where will workers and landowners spend their money? Is it going to be in this parish, or are they going to go to Calcasieu and spend the money there? You know, and is that going to affect your sales tax collections and things like that? There are also new rules related to carbon capture, sequestration wells, and pipelines. There was just an emergency rule since this report was written that they are using a sort of a starting point to figure out how much they can collect in property taxes from these wells. Now, it's not very much right now. We'll have to see where that comes. Legislative discussions regarding local revenues related to lands that are not state-owned. So I'm sure you've all heard about the meeting tomorrow, and none of those are even revenue. There's House Bill 444 that has $3 per metric ton of carbon stored going to the parishes. We don't know if that's going to pass, if it will go to the Senate and pass, it'll go to the governor's office and be signed. We're not sure. But we are still in this area where we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And there's also excise tax being proposed on pipelines around. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and we'll have a much clearer picture after this session is over. There's also the status of the federal 45Q tax credit with the new administration. So is that going to be changed? Is the new administration going to get rid of it? Are they going to change it? Are they going to give more? Are they going to give less? You've often heard that this tax credit is about $85 per metric ton. Well, $85 in 2022 sure doesn't buy, the same amount in 2025. So it's still $85. We'll see how much that is. And of course, as mentioned, changes in millage rates over time. Okay? Now this, you're going to hear a lot about how the state wants to decarbonize. You're going to hear a lot about, from the state's perspective. But this is from Allen Parish's perspective. Lots of questions you have and everything. But we do have to look at the fact that a lot of international customers, some national interests do want to decarbonize, right? So economic development projects in Louisiana highlight a growing commitment to CCS, right? Across various industries, aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while supporting economic growth. You have all these companies up here, they all want a carbon capture component because maybe their customers over in the EU want to buy, carbon neutral products. Pardon. So building a robust CCS infrastructure can make Allen Parish a more attractive destination for future projects with carbon capture needs. So sometimes when a company's looking to relocate, they'll say, how close are you to a carbon pipeline, right? Can you sort of tilt that up a little bit? Because there are costs to these companies, right? You have to pay to capture it. You have to pay to compress it. You have to pay to transport it, and then you have to pay to store it. So if you are in an area that's closer to the pipeline, or the transportation cost won't be as much, well then you might be more attractive to, electricity generation, natural gas processing, cement processing, all this sort of stuff. So going into the future, if you do have an infrastructure, I did want to say that could be beneficial to attracting new economic development projects. As companies, you can't really see that, but as companies look for an inexpensive and efficient way to decarbonize and store their carbon.
Can we please get the lights turned back on and we'll go ahead and jump into our Q&A portion?
Taking that
First question, what are the safety factors of CO2 capture?
Okay, I just want to remind you all, the question was, what are the safety factors of CO2 capture? So CO2 capture is the actual separation of the CO2 where it's being generated. So like an industrial plant where they're burning coal, for example, and they either separate the CO2 out before they burn the coal or they separate it after. There are a number of industrial processes that generate CO2. Making ammonia, for example, using natural gas and nitrogen and separating it out. So the safety factors are basically what the safety factors are within chemical plants. There's great control. I mean, the emissions that come out are all controlled and permitted, by Louisiana DEQ, for example. They know what's coming up the stack, and they have to report that every year. So if somebody's trying to make CO2 and capture it, they're going to be separating that out with a very high degree of efficiency. Thanks.
How will the separation of gases be handled?
Okay, this would be, I guess, under the capture question again, separation of gases. That's a very highly technical chemical engineering kind of area. Like one way is if you have natural gas that comes out of the ground with CO2 in it, they have a number of types of equipment that can separate the CO2 by absorbing it onto some different chemicals, like amines. Trapping is the most common way. And so they run the natural gas through this unit that has amines that absorb the CO2, and then they change the temperature and drive the CO2 off from that. There's a whole range of different technologies for doing these kinds of separations of gases. A lot of them involve cooling to very low temperatures. We call that cryogenic separation. And you'll see these type of things in the oil field and also within chemical plants. Yes.
How many times have you been contracted to conduct a risk assessment for Exxon or any other company wanting to open sites for carbon sequestration?
Okay, me personally, Mike Sims, I haven't done any work for Exxon. Our company has not done any of that type of work. In my background, in my past, I've been working in the field of geology for over 40 years. I've worked on geologic planning for CO2 sequestration projects in Australia a long, long time ago. Also in North Africa. I've kind of been following this field for many years, but haven't done any work for ExxonMobil or any work for Oxy, or any risk assessments in Louisiana, in relation to this type of work. And I can say that same for the other folks on our project team.
What will be the actual financial benefit for Allen Parish?
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait to see how this session pulls out, right? Because right now, I showed just from the economic activity, either using the model or the ratios that were used, you're looking at, 3.5 to 4.4, but that's just the economic activity. As I said, we're going to have to wait till session comes. They're going to have to get their property tax revenues down. They're going to have to figure out if, once it gets to Ways and Means, are they going to do an injection tax to give to the locals and things like that? So we are still in uncertain territory as to what it's going to be. So I worked with what was provided, And if there are more projects that would scale up, you could double it if you're going to have another project of the same size. If you don't believe it, you can take half of that, and that's what it would be. But from the economic activity, we are showing, I don't want to say small, but certainly not like, it's going to depend a lot on how the property taxes and the injection taxes sort of flesh out over the next few months.
Very little.
How can this company guarantee that the safe drinking water will not be violated by any accidental contamination?
Okay.
Okay, that's a joke, that's a joke.
Okay, the drinking water is the issue of the underground storage, the underground source of drinking water, USDW, we were talking about. So, for groundwater to be effective, the CO2 has to get out of the sequestration reservoir and move up into shallower zones. The most direct pathway, as we were saying, are the old wells. The other pathways are extremely indirect, or really no pathway at all when you have multiple play zones above the sequestration zone. Like, for example, the Frio is at 6,000 feet. You don't get up into fresh groundwater until the 2,300 to 3,000 foot range, just even into brackish water that would be, part of the USDW. So you got this large interval in between, but that can be short-circuited by the old wells. So as I was saying before, the critical thing is that the old wells have to be identified and have to be remediated to.
It could be
to
or
shut
it
them
will
off.
be short-circuited.
Pardon?
It could be or it will be short-circuited.
Well, it could be, depends on where the plume goes relative to that well.
Could be.
So
Nobody knows where the plume is.
if the well is actually in the area where the plume is going to go, there's a very high
What about the
chance.
wells that the state does not have record of, or Exxon?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the things that both the EPA and the state wants people to do, and some of these people are already gone ahead and doing this, is to search for old wells using various kinds of geophysical technologies. An old well is made out of steel, and so it has a magnetic signal that it makes. So if you go over it with a magnetometer, like the easiest way is with an aircraft, like a drone flying at low level, doing a survey of an area. And so if it sees a bullseye of magnetism at a location, then you try to find out, is there a well there? Some of the old wells are poorly located. So you may know that a well's in a certain section of a township, and you may say it's somewhere in this 1 square mile area. It potentially could be that bad in some cases. So any way you look at this, you're going to have to do some kind of surge with different technologies. Another way that people are looking at is with this very high resolution aerial photography to look at, and looking at it over time, to look if there's remains of old roads that went into drill sites.
Sir, we can't even clean up a train wreck. How the heck we gonna use all that technology to do what you're saying we're gonna do?
Well, I think it works pretty good.
What about Exxon? So they spending $210 million on a dry hole, correct? Right? Most costliest well in history. Okay,
Yeah,
that
I
was
don't
it.
know.
Hey, that was Exxon itself. Besides BP, the Deepwater Horizon, right?
Yeah.
They spent that much money on a dry hole. How the hell are they going to contain all this over here?
Well,
What about the 150,000 wells, other wells that they drill, okay, before that they're not even talking about? State doesn't have the record of.
well,
They don't even have a name.
Sir,
They don't even have
let's
names on
finish
it.
this
Well,
question
just-
and we'll get to
well,
your
we're
next
just-
item.
This
No,
is
we're
the
talking
same
about
thing.
it right now,
This
man.
is the same thing.
no, let me just say this. Speaking of expensive dry holes, Mobil, before they became part of Exxon, drilled a $1 billion dry hole up in Alaska. So, I mean, the oil industry has a lot of experience with expensive dry holes.
Oh, I see that.
They put a lot of money.
Deepwater Horizon was a good
Well,
example of that.
Yeah, the Deepwater Horizon was a tremendous, huge blowout. Yes, sir.
I don't mean to be rude.
No.
We still didn't get the answer we were asking. Trying to get to that particular answer.
Yeah.
Other people have questions they would like to ask you. I don't mean to be disrespectful.
No, I appreciate
We
it.
get a whole lot of, what that did, this and that. Our biggest concern is for Allen Parish. Allen Parish's residents, Allen Parish's condition.
Right.
Earlier, you said that it was, this particular storage of CO2 was mobile, right? You said that it was mobile, which meant that it could be difficult to be contained. So its mobility, cope with its inability to be contained, makes it almost impossible to control. Therefore, allowing it to seep into wells that he's mentioning that are unknown and getting into the water table. That worse than that, escaping into substations, flood surface stations, and causing it to escape into the atmosphere. So, all we're hearing tonight is a lot of data, but the data is not really accurate enough, or no disrespect to Dr. from the East, he doesn't have a solid economic number to use. In the last 27 years, Allen Parish, $7 million is absolutely nothing. Allen Parish has received $7 million somewhere near from the compact of Charlotte and state of Louisiana. We don't have a road that you could drive on. We don't have parks that our children can actually play in. So $7 million is nothing for a parish that is actually struggling. We hear a lot of, and my name is Pastor Bello, we hear a lot of projections, but we're not hearing anything solid or stable. We're simple people. We want an answer. Can it be contained? No. That's the end of it. The reason why it can't be contained is volatility. Causes it to erode concrete. So metal piping that has been in the ground hundreds of years, almost 100 years, is nothing. It's going to actually eat through it like a hot knife. So we cannot tell, nor can you tell us, that a company where we can go home and rest, that in this production, this opportunity for ExxonMobil, from what we see, the only people that are going to actually benefit from it is ExxonMobil, any other company that's involved in it, and whoever in our parish represents us, and I'm going to say straight out, who is pushing for this monetary gain. Because there are people here that, I'm going to say this, really don't understand 85% of what was said to us tonight. Because we don't have a degree in geology, seismicity, underground tremors. The state of Louisiana sits on an aquifer, sits on an area where our aquifer is already, as you contain sand covered and sand protected. But in order for it to produce the layer in which you're going to have this CO2 stored, you're dependent upon the sand layers to create a certain surface of where it's going to cause a sealing, where you can go in and receive it. Am I right?
Well, it's the clay layers.
Yes, clay layers, okay, right.
There's a lot of clay down there.
You're dependent on that, right?
Yeah.
We're depending on that to keep our water table safe so that we can keep drinking water and we can live longer. We have elders that don't know what's being done. And then on top of that, this particular project here sounds like a self-absorbed project for a major trillion-dollar company soon to be that does nothing for a group of people who can barely survive the world middle class.
Sir, I appreciate your comment, and there is a time for verbal questions to come up and speak.
We've been here so long listening to all this other stuff. We've been ready for
I understand. I'm doing my job by following a format, and you will have your opportunity to speak.
Yeah, let's go ahead and finish the submitted questions, and then, but we appreciate your comment. And, you know, and one thing I want to say is this is a complex subject. There is no doubt that there is a tremendous amount of information that goes into this, and we don't want to be boring you or throw in a lot of highly technical stuff, that we want it to be understandable and try to explain it. So, you know, the goal of everything we've been talking about tonight is to try to explain what are these different aspects of this. It is a very complex issue, and we appreciate that. So let's go on. What's the next one?
Can the PowerPoint be posted on the APPJ website? Yes.
Okay.
From your assessment, would these type of projects bring people to want to live in the area or not consider this area to raise their family? Do you know the population of people that would be impacted with these projects, and how does that population compare to other projects in Louisiana?
Yeah, that's a big question, and there are a lot of parts of it. Let me just say this, you know, the ideal project is in an area where nobody's living for this type of CO2 project. And, you know, so when I look at it, and I'm not choosing any favorites or whatever, but when you look at the Oxy project, it's a wildlife management area. So if their plume was contained in that area, and if they could remediate those small number of wells that are in there, about 12 wells, and if that CO2 stayed within that area, it's a pretty long area
How big
north
of an
south.
area you estimate 300,000 tons is? How far is this thing gonna move? I mean,
well,
we can see the map of all the wells. You really think it's gonna stay
yeah.
under that one area?
Well, Oxy thinks that their plume is going to extend out to north about 6 miles. And that lease area is about 12 miles or 14 miles north-south in the West Bay Wildlife Management Area. I think it's like, we have it written down, I think it's, I can't remember, it's 28,000 acres, or I think that's what it is, but it's in the report. So if their plume just extends out from their wells northward and stays within that area, you know, there isn't anybody living directly above that. Now, there are homes to the west, not so much to the east, because then you're right in the valley of the Calcasieu River, but, you know, the town of Biddy and, you know, related areas around there are to the west of that lease. But if that plume stays under that property, I think
in the
that,
clay, in the sand.
well,
How do they
I-
know where it's gonna stop when
Well,
it moves? When
yeah.
They don't.
How
They
could
don't.
they possibly come up?
It didn't do it in
with where it's
Illinois,
gonna
and it
stop?
didn't do it in Ohio.
Yeah.
It didn't do it in North
All
Dakota.
this
It
stuff
didn't do it in
is
South
great.
Dakota, and they're coming here.
All
Sir,
this stuff
please,
is
let's
great.
They're
finish
coming
one
here.
question
Know
at
where
a
it's gonna
time.
go.
I'm sorry, what's that?
All this is great, but how do we know where it's gonna go?
They don't.
where it's
Until you
gonna
put it
stop?
in the ground,
How
they don't
can you-
know.
Well,
Give
let me
a minute,
answer
Joel.
this question.
How can you ever know that?
Well-
How can you ever say there's no risk or minimum risk when that can go anywhere at any time and nobody knows how it's gonna stop, where it's gonna stop, or when it's gonna stop?
Well-
And how many lives will it take for us to be proven right to lose?
Well, let me explain. You know, like Gary said, you know, the regulations
And I've got
have
a
this.
question in the pile too, man.
Okay, thanks. Just to answer your question, and it's a very, very large and complex issue, but the regulations require this iterative approach where you monitor, you do calculations, you make estimates, you check those with the monitoring data, and a lot of it depends on the geology. When you look at a situation like Allen Parish and some neighboring parishes, you know, I've done a lot of work in Evangeline Parish and St. Landry, Point Coupee, various other areas, and the geology up in this part of Louisiana is simpler than farther south. When you go down to I-10, you get a lot more faulting, and the dip increases tremendously. The formations are like dropping.
Is there faults in this area also?
Very, very few in this
And do
area.
we
Where
know
are they?
exactly where they are?
Where are
Sir,
they?
can we please get back to the question that was asked originally so that we can answer?
Yeah, let
this
me
question?
answer that. But the point is that the regulations require this iterative approach to evaluating the plume and knowing where it's going to go. And if you're working in an area of relatively simple geology, you have a good starting point for making those estimates of where the plume's going to go. Like when again, I'm not picking any favorites, but when I look at that Oxy project, I say, man, these guys picked a very good lease. They're very simple geology structurally. The layer underground is not sloping super steeply. The CO2 is going to migrate northward, but it's going to be very slow. A situation like that is what everybody hopes for in this business. So, but again, I'm not picking any favorites. But when it comes to the question was like how many people are living over that area, for the Oxy project, very few or none. For the Exxon projects, there are individual homes scattered out between patches of forest land and farmers that are within that area. I can't tell you exactly.
Farmers then, huh? Just farmers, don't worry about the farmers.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just answering the question.
We've got property right by everything.
I'm sorry.
6 miles.
Uh-huh.
Amen. Amen.
Oh, yeah, no. I'm not saying
And when it gets to 6 miles, it stops, right? When that plume goes 6 miles, it stops.
Well, I think that's their prediction over 50 years.
Prediction.
In the meantime.
Prediction.
But in the meantime, there's other processes going on too.
6 miles and it's going to stop. That barbed wire fence that I've got over there will make it stop, right?
Let me go back to this question. Okay, the population.
I've got 5-strand barbed wire fence. It'll make it stop at 6 miles, right?
Okay, well, let me go on with this question. The last part was, how does that population compare to other projects in Louisiana? Okay, so other projects in Louisiana, there are some that are in areas that really don't have any population at all, like the project that is coming up for a public hearing next week in Hackberry. It's the Sempra Energy project. That's all on marshland that company owns. Now, I don't know about the boundaries of the project, like when you get north of there, you're getting...
I'm pretty sure they're kicking it out too, I believe, over there. Well, I understand they're kicking it out too, they don't want it either.
Okay, well, yeah, I don't know any of the details on that. Some of the other projects, like under Lake Maurepas, obviously there's nobody living right over that, but the people to the north of there have their questions and concerns also. And then some of the other projects are down in the coastal area, like in marsh areas, like right on the coast, like at the south end of Calcasieu Lake, for example, in Calcasieu Parish. So, yes.
The first question I asked about, are these projects going to consider someone to live in this area and want to raise a family, or should they not consider that? Because we just moved here a couple years ago to take care of my mom and dad. But if we should consider not living here very long, I would rather that and then have my kids raised in our area.
Yeah.
But I don't want that because I love this community and this culture and where we are. But I'm just trying to figure out if it's...
Well, I think...
Would you tell your grandkids or your daughters to come move here?
Well, here's my honest, fair answer. I see the risk as being pretty low for these projects. Obviously...
So why do you say you don't want to build it near anybody?
Well, that gives you a better control,
Total control.
Always when it comes to any risk, like, let's say driving, there's a risk associated with that. I'm not trying to be silly. No, I know, but I'm just saying that when it comes to risk, one way of controlling the risk is just don't drive. Just walk everywhere. It'd be a lot safer.
We're talking about
No, you're right.
We're talking about
and there's always a trade-off. And I'm not trying to be superficial about that. But the point I'm making is that there always are risks, and the way they can be managed is by removing the hazards, you know? And that's what we were talking about in terms of plugging the wells, the old wells, identifying them and plugging them, getting rid of that pathway, adding to the pipeline safety so that, you know, if you do live within, you know, a short distance of a pipeline, that if there was some kind of an accident, some rupture of the pipeline, something like that, that the pipeline shutoff valves would limit the amount of CO2 coming out, and the monitors would pick it up, you know, and so on. You definitely want things like that. But when you look at, you know, the actual history of pipelines, I mean, the pipeline that runs through the southern part of the parish near Elton, you know, does not have failures associated.
It's got 42 leaks so far on it.
Okay.
42 leaks. And your valves are 40 miles apart. And there's an orthotic control on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well
that's the pipeline you're talking about, coming from Baton Rouge to Houston.
Okay. Well, let's see.
And it goes across.
Okay. Yeah.
You got
Okay.
44 leaks. Had one in Benton the other day.
Okay. Well, let me go on with just trying to finish up this question. Your question was, would this be a place you want to live because of this? And you know, I think that there are a lot of different answers for that. Like, if there is economic development that is beneficial for your family, that could be a factor that would be a help. On the other hand, if you were living in a situation where you thought you were at risk, that's not a good situation. Personally, as I've said, I think that the risks, I mean, I think that if you're right next to the CO2, the green pipeline, you're going to want more controls. You don't want leaks to be occurring from that. But if you're living farther away from it, you know, you're not going to be affected by it. Honestly, you're not. So it all depends on exactly where you are and what the nature of the projects are and what's being done to control these projects.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
What you're saying, though, where we live at, where we live is where we live. Y'all bringing it to us. It's not that we are.
Well, I'm not involved in bringing it to y'all. I'm just trying to give you information.
You ain't helping us stop it.
Well,
and y'all should be. Y'all are the professionals. Y'all know how dangerous it is. Y'all over here trying to tell us.
No, we're not.
Okay, we're going to move over to the verbal questions.
They're getting paid. We're not.
Yeah, they're supposed to get paid to give us a risk assessment, and they're just selling us on it.
No, we're not trying to sell you.
You may want to clarify. You may want to clarify the reason for your presentation. That's just to provide information directly to a written report, so that get people on the same page.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. We are trying to provide information to you that we believe is balanced and it gives you multiple sides of story, which is very complex. You know, and I think you had your hand up first, and I'll point to you.
We're going to move to the verbal questions, Mike.
Okay.
I didn't see any evaluation factors or, effects to property values in your economic analysis, like what the net present value would be of this activity. Because we don't know, like, how many pipelines are going to come in with this new eminent domain laws, with the infrastructure right next to people's properties. Like, the devaluation of people's properties is a big concern for a lot of
Exactly. I did do a net present value in terms of a very conservative inflation and a very and a higher discount rate to actually sort of make out.
The devaluation?
No, I did not do the devaluation. I looked at this as an example project, and so let me jump ahead of another question. If I believe those numbers that were given to me, obviously I'm not here to call anyone a liar or call anyone a truth teller, correct? But what I can say is that these can be scaled up or scaled down. If you don't believe it and you think that it was, half that amount, you can divide them by 2 and that would show it. And if you think that it's going to be triple that amount, you can, increase it by 3. But no, I didn't take into account, there's a ton of uncertainty. You notice I was not going to just speculate or pull tons of things out of the air, right? I want some data, so I'm not we aren't really positive what's going to happen to property values, houses, or anything like that. But in terms of the net present value, yes, I did the inflation and the discount rate.
But no devaluation factors were put into your report.
No devaluation for, you're talking about property values, homes, things like that. Yeah.
The infrastructure risk and the ugliness of the infrastructure, and then not only that, but the uncertainty of the amount of pipelines that can come into Louisiana because of eminent domain laws. So there's
Yeah,
a
and
lot
those
of-
eminent domain laws, and you see that's also more uncertainty, right? Because they're doing unitization over at Baton Rouge, and they're going to start. Yeah,
the wells. The
I know. The pipelines are other things, and there's
then
next.
not only that, but with Fort School, I was told by our state representative exactly the same thing. Which means that people that have infrastructure that's ugly, CO2 infrastructure right near their property, and their property values are done. Even if you have the risk and the ugliness.
Oh, I understand what you're saying, but we did not calculate that from the economic
Yeah, I
impact
didn't
models.
see it right in the map.
No, did not.
Okay, first question, it looks like Dev Bella? The first question was regarding what amount of guarantee can you give us if it's safe, or if it's safety factor? Whoever submitted this form, yeah, you can come speak.
Thank you.
Well, who is this person that?
That's me.
Okay.
We got a microphone right there.
No, there's not a mic.
Microphone.
They said one.
Oh, that's another. Hello, this one. This one. Thank you. Wow. Preacher say I like it. My question was just, is there a could you guarantee safety for the residents of the parish with this type of question? My answer has already been given, that it is almost impossible to guarantee because of its mobility, because of its incapability of being contained, and its incapability of being controlled. So that's been answered. I think that what really we're not getting grasping a hold of is that as the professor said, all you're going to have is a small surge of a trinket of economic youth. And that's when the project is being constructed. Then when they leave, and they leave a few people here, economically, you're going to suffer. Because you could multiply the project by 20 times, and you still wouldn't produce enough economic development or financial development to keep this parish floating and moving successfully. Number one, we don't have anywhere in the parish city where people who come here to work can actually spend enough money to raise our tax base. Number two, we don't have anywhere for them to live. So the next adjoining parishes, Jeff Davis, Calcasieu, Rapides, are the parishes that are going to benefit if there's any kind of benefit, which is only for a few years or so before the project is complete. My question is, the health risk. Nobody said anything about the health risk, about containing this CO2 and what the impacts is going to be, because nobody can guarantee that it won't escape. That's right. Nobody can guarantee that the surface wells used to contain, the surface construction used to contain it, can guarantee us, because first of all, you've got human error. Somebody has to maintain it, all right? If something happens on these surface wells or these surface areas where it's being contained, it's being controlled, it's being tested, whatever it is, by the time it escapes into the atmosphere, escapes into the situation where people get impacted by it, nobody can guarantee that you won't have people dying from this, from various sicknesses and diseases down through the years.
Okay, let's give the guys the opportunity to answer that question. what amount of guarantee can you give us of its safety?
I believe the short answer is there really is no way to guarantee 100%. That's why there's a risk evaluation process. And as Mike had explained, there's a spectrum of risk based on A, the consequences of it occurring, and B, the consequences of that occurrence on your health. The closer you are to the release, obviously, depending on the weather conditions and what have you, the greater the risk you may have of having some consequence, health consequence, such as asphyxiation, as we had explained. If you're further away from the release point, then and maybe upwind or it's windier, then your risks are much lower to maybe zero at some point. So it's a moving spectrum. It's a place and time situation.
Right.
And we're hopeful, right? So we're not the regulator.
This
is my group, and we're a third-party consulting firm that was tasked with providing Allen Parish a unbiased
now there are people
project.
There are people from Exxon that are here, sitting
Well,
in the back.
and one thing that
Hold on.
said
There
about-
are people. Hold on. Let me explain. There are people here from the back. And we're gonna probably speak with them or speak and talk on both sides of in Baton Rouge because we're going to the Capitol. What you just said actually gives us what the parish residents really want to understand. There is no way to guarantee that this is going to be safe or economically beneficial for our parish.
If you upwind, it's okay.
It doesn't matter where you are. It's like grabbing a hold of a snake.
That's what he said.
Yes, you don't know where it's slipping from. And I don't think it's worth putting lives at risk, anyone's lives. It doesn't matter. I heard it a bit earlier about presidents should be doing so, governors. That doesn't matter. These particular things does not knock on your door and ask if you are a Democrat, Republican, Independent. It just takes lives. If it releases, it takes lives. So
I appreciate your question. If you have 3 other questions as well, if we can move on to those, I want to give everybody the opportunity that submitted questions to be able to ask their questions.
Ma'am, you can pull mine. He covered everything I wanted to ask.
We're going to have some
Todd
questions.
Taylor.
Listen, I'm going to say this. We're not hostile towards you.
No.
We understand
I
you're doing the
understand.
job.
My job is to give everybody the opportunity
Right.
to speak and to have your concerns heard so that
Right.
somebody can maybe address your concern or
Right.
give you a little bit more information about it. I have no hard feelings against anybody.
Right.
I give him my time.
So I'm taking his time.
Please
You
go
do
ahead.
it, too. Go, buddy.
I'm taking his time. We're not hostile towards you. We understand you've been hired to do a job, right? And you did the job the best that you can. We appreciate everything that's going on. And I'm only speaking for myself when I say we and a few people that I know that feel the way I am. But I believe that there's a large percentage of the parish, Allen Parish, that does not want this particular project to go through in our parish. There is a majority, and I'm going to say this to the guys that are here, Chris and all the other guys here from Exxon. I am baffled. No. I am flabbergasted by the fact that something with this magnitude, the residents, not the representatives, the real residents of Allen Parish did not get an opportunity to vote on something like this. That blows me away. You understand? We have people that represent us, and I'm not down in representatives. You understand? They made the decision on what was given to them information-wise at the point. But at some point, when you start talking about the volatility of this particular situation, the danger, the capability of escape, the incapability of total control, you put this in a position where every individual in Allen Parish should have a right to make the decision whether they want it or they don't want it. And I believe that if it goes to that, we're going to find out. I see you this sign. Thank you. I'm a pastor. That's okay. I have a coat for you. But let me tell you something. Let me say something. Listen. One human life, just one human life. I'm telling you from personal experience. One human life in no way compares to the few $1 million that Allen Parish is going to receive. I'm going to say that to you. So my question is, my last question is, why is this coming to Allen Parish with the scale that showed so many wells that were left in the parish, in our area? Highway 26, and when the project, they're thinking about projected project testing, is just across the road from their community. And there are people here who live in the Swallow area who are going to be right on top of it. And right there in West Bay, when we tried to get a lake through here, we were told that it was impossible to live in West Bay because of a specific endangered species of ours. And all of a sudden, they don't matter now. Fish don't matter in Calcasieu River. 6 Mile doesn't matter. And everything else that we do doesn't matter. The canoeing industry, how do people know that they're going to be playing around the canoe? They say. We don't know that. That's what we're saying. We don't know. And the other problem is, we're just finding out about it after all these representatives and all these other people have been knowing about it since 2019. We're just starting to understand about it. I'm not trying to be honest. I know that y'all are trying to do a good job. We don't want to be sold something that's going to cost us $5, $50 years down the road.
Jordan, uncle. You want the mic?
Yes.
I'm probably loud enough already, but.
Thank you.
Do I need to ask the question on my paper, or can I just?
Do what you want to do.
The whole point of this purpose is if you wanted to be able to ask your question, you ask your question, one of the guys on the panel answers, you go to your next question. Guys, back and forth.
Yes, ma'am. A lot of my questions that I had written down were answered, and then there were some new questions that were brought up. And I apologize, I get really emotional. But one of the things that stuck out to me tonight was that you said, one of the high hazards, one of the high risks is living next to these pipelines. And I live 2/10 of a mile from a pipeline that's 30 miles long. And then yesterday I was riding the golf cart with my little boy, he's 3, and we found another pipeline, and it runs north and south. And so I got curious, and I said, well, where's the injection site? So I rode to the reservation, and I found the proposed injection site, and I saw how close it was to the reservation, to their housing, to their school, the little Indian school. And, for somebody like me, I have 4 kids, and we live right there in the crosshairs. So I have the one pipeline that runs north and south, and I have the other one that runs east and west. And the pipeline that runs east and west is 30 miles long, and we're also, we're downwind from that. And there's already been 3 leaks on this pipeline. So what would you say to somebody like me with 4 small children? What would you suggest for me to do?
What are the risks to her and her family? That's what she's asking. What is the risk? She gave you a scenario, and she wants to know what the risk is.
Okay, well, let me just ask you, Allen Parish has a lot of natural gas pipelines going through it. Over in the southeast corner, just over a really short distance, there's the Denver Green Pipeline, which is a CO2 pipeline. So, you said you live near West Bay? Oh,
No,
I'm sorry.
sir.
I'm sorry.
She lives by the green pipeline.
I live by the Green Pipeline.
Oh, okay, so you live down
I live, both of these pipelines are both CO2 Denver pipelines.
Yeah, because the only Denver pipeline that I know is that one that's kind of running more or less east-west. The other ones crossing it and running north-south are natural gas. But But anyway, you know, any pipeline has a hazard, although the pipeline industry will tell you that they've been very safe in terms of number of accidents per mile, per year, all these kind of things. But, you know, natural gas pipelines, you know, if somebody hits it accidentally, like the third party type damage, you know, that I was talking about.
She wants to know the
that
CO2 release to her family.
Yeah.
What's the risk?
Yeah,
She
well.
don't care about natural gas.
Now, CO2 for the green pipeline, you know, from looking through records, you know, you said that there's been a number of leaks, but from looking through records, I've not found those. But if there are leaks going on, you know, the pipeline needs to get those under control. And, you know, if they're monitoring their pipeline properly, and if they're operating it properly, and using enhanced safety, you know, which now that Exxon's taken over the Denbury company and all their assets, you know, there's a possibility that they may, you know, have a greater focus on safety. It's just my observation, you know, I believe. So, you know, I think what you need to do, in my opinion, is press for making sure that the pipeline company is doing the safety things that they need to do. If there are releases of CO2 on that pipeline, those need to be reported, and the regulatory authorities need to know that too. You know, but and it needs to be confirmed, are there releases, and those need to be monitored and controlled. So I think really, depending on how close you are to it, where your house is, you know, you need to talk to the regulators and talk to the pipeline company, the Exxon people, you know, who now own that, and ask them what they're doing for safety.
And there is a single point of contact option through LDQ's website where you can report incidents and they come out to inspect it.
So what she said was if there's a CO2 release, she can expect to be dead, and her kids also, because they're close, kids are closer to the ground. They may pass away, but she won't, because it hugs the ground for a very long time. She wants to know the risk.
Yeah, well, it all depends on how close you are to the pipeline and how much CO2 comes out. What happened in Satartia, Mississippi was probably at the upper end of risk in terms of, you know, the release took place over a number of hours before they got it under control. It happened at night, which is generally the worst conditions, less wind to disperse it.
Wasn't it 4 hours dissipation?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
It was a long
So what's
time
she
before they
supposed to
got
do
it shut
if
off.
she
I'm 2/10 of a mile from the pipeline that runs east and west.
Okay.
And then the pipeline that I discovered yesterday, it says Denbury CO2 pipeline, and it runs north and south, and it's 1 mile directly east of my house.
Okay. I'd worry less about the one that's a mile away, but the one that's 2/10 of a mile, I mean, you're looking at 1,000 feet away. And again, you know, I think you need to ask, like Emily was saying, a single point of contact, you know, ask what they're doing to monitor and maintain safety on that pipeline. And, you know, I think any pipeline for people living near it is something that needs to be, you know, the public needs to know what's there and what the risks are.
Yes, sir. When you submit in that spot, the single point of contact, typically they're going to send a representative from the agency out to your property to meet with you, inspect the site, if you give them approval to come onto your property. And the next step from there is they're going to reach out to whoever owns that pipeline. There will have to be some type of communication with whoever's operating that pipeline to follow up.
No, your risk assessment should say that the regulations do not require any type of above ground air monitoring, automatic sirens and stuff like that. The risk assessment doesn't cover that.
Yeah.
And it should, because it's a release, when you release from the pipelines, you basically said you're on your own.
I spoke
Your
with
report
Exxon
says,
Tuesday.
basically, if you got a pipeline release, you're on your own. Because there's too many hands involved in it, too many people claim to regulate it, and they want it for the money, but nobody's gonna change any of the rules or regulations for monitoring the actual CO2 being released onto the public.
That's right.
Let's let Ms. Jordan finish her question.
I spoke with Exxon Tuesday. I went to the meeting at Coshada, and that was one of the things that I had brought up to them. I said, what are your safety protocols? What do you have in place? How do you have our emergency responders prepared in the event of a leak? How are you going to alert me and my family so that I can, safely take care of my family? And the response that I received was basically that in the event of a leak, that the CO2 was going to linger around the pipeline and that I really shouldn't worry because it's not going to affect my family.
Now remember, the CO2 people brag about CO2 being colorless and odorless. So she has no clue that a death cloud is engulfing her. And so the regulations should require that mercaptans be put into the gas. Your risk assessment didn't cover anything about it being colorless and odorless, and it should have mercaptans in it so that people immediately can smell that natural gas and they know what to do.
There has been a lot of talk in the industry about putting odorizers in it. Like when it comes to, there's kind of two sides to the CO2 pipelines. They're the ones that are specifically associated with CO2 sequestration projects, so they go right to an injection well. And there's been a big push in the regulations for those, to have more monitoring and all. Now the interstate pipelines like the Denver Green pipeline also are regulated. Now there's a new rule that's being developed that was just published in January by the federal government that is for enhanced monitoring and safety requirements on CO2 pipelines that start addressing all these issues for these interstate ones, like the one that you live near. And that's to try to address these issues of, continuing releases, monitoring so you know that they're there. I don't know what the requirement is on odorizers in that particular regulation. Do y'all remember? Doyle, do you remember if there's a odorizer? Yeah, I know that there's, but I mean in the proposed rule that was in dated January, was there an odorizer?
That's usually distribution systems, right? Not transmission.
Oh, okay.
As far as your odor.
Okay.
There's 4 agencies that claim to regulate pipelines. None of them are going to do anything. They've stated that. I mean, they talked about it, but none of them are going to take any action relative to monitor their CO2 releases.
When it comes to the distribution lines within a CO2 injection project, for Class 6 well, but there is discussion of monitoring for those.
But they're not doing it. They've had the discussion and said, we ain't touching it. We're taking the money, but we're not going to do anything.
Yeah, well, the folks I've talked to said that they would do that. But anyway, I think that for you personally, you need to pursue this with Exxon and, just, get a bit, ask them for a better answer, I think, is really given how close you are to that pipeline. If you were a mile away from it, I would think that there's less probability of a release getting to you. But being as close as you are, when you look at history of releases, there could be a potential.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you.
Ms. Ira Savol? I blame it on, I'm sorry, I have a Mississippi accent.
You said a lot.
It's family name.
Hey, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your efforts at doing the risk assessment here. I've got a question about the liability limits and the related risk. The legislature has granted the companies involved in this some pretty strict or low liability limits. As I understand them, it's $250,000 for property damage, $500,000 for personal injury or loss of life. And I think after 10 years, the state assumes liability, although I don't know when that 10 years starts. I saw in a committee hearing a couple of years ago an archived video where it was stated that those liability limits are required for these projects to be economically viable for the companies. And so I'm just wondering how these, what seem to be quite restrictive liability limits correspond to the risk. And the idea that this might be low risk or that we even know the risk. You know, I'm guessing an insurance actuary could actually correlate a rough level of risk with this kind of liability. So I'm wondering if y'all thought of that, if y'all asked those questions, if you looked into that. Is there any way, my question is, it seems like we've got some very restricted liability compared to the risk that's being presented.
Yeah, we're just trying to exchange a few ideas on that. That's a very complex and very important question. But our initial feeling is it's a little outside the scope of what our report was getting at, but I still think it's an important question to address. And let me just make a few comments. I think that state taking over the liability is after the closure, or is it after the post-injection closure period? So, but anyway, I'll tell you what, we'll look into that in terms of, you know, what those dollar limits are on liability, and try to find out what the source of that is. That's actually an area that I've not read anything about in terms of, you know, what's in regular.
Okay, thank you. I had two other questions, if it is okay. So you've noted that drilling has been going on here for about 100 years, and I know it seems just prior to the 80s or 90s it was probably a lot less regulated, or a little more seat of the pants, you might say. I'm wondering if there's any consideration been given to what potentially has been disposed at the bottom of some of these old wells. In other words, materials that just were conveniently gotten rid of, and I'm sure it's probably undocumented, no one was going to document this, but do we know that that's happened? Do we know any idea of the prevalence of that possibly having happened, or is that potentially an issue?
I think you're absolutely correct. It wouldn't be reported as such, more than likely, unless it was a complaint from someone that would have filed a complaint for an action like that. The oil and gas company more than likely would not be reporting that, or the operator that was serving in that capacity, if that's what happened towards the end of the life of the project. But I would say, you know, the rules that are in place for these projects will, A, have to identify all of the penetrations that fall within the area of review, or the area where the plume is being predicted to migrate, if you will, outward. And those wellbore histories will be evaluated both by the operator, that's the permittee, as well as the regulator. And they will need to be, corrective actions will be necessary to address any of the wellbores that are posing a risk due to lack of cement and or casing that is sufficient to prevent the corrosivity action if it's penetrating into the potential or through the formation where the CO2 sequestration will occur.
Okay, thank you, sir. My last question, you mentioned having done some work for Australia, projects in Australia. I recently read an article where in the politics of this in Australia, they're actually questioning whether this is going to be economically viable at all there. And some of the major CO2 producers, oil companies, et cetera, are just saying it's not going to be affordable there. My question here is where is the funding coming from now? Where is it supposed to come from in the future? And is it sustainable, the way this is going to be paid for?
I'll make a few comments. Yeah, that's another really excellent question, and it's a really, really deep question. And let me just make a few comments. You know, if you talk to people in the industry that want to do this, they'll say that the tax credit that's called 45Q, you know, for the federal tax credit, so many dollars per ton of CO2, they'll say that that tax credit alone is not sufficient for the economics. And, you know, I don't know the details of all that. I've just heard this from a number of different people involved in the industry. And it was more of a concern a few years ago when it was lower. It was $50 per ton. Now it's, I guess, $85 per ton. But of course, you know, as Dr. Groth mentioned, there is an inflation effect, you know, that doesn't get that much more money, you know. But a lot of the people in the industry have said that the economics is more supported by fuel credits or credits for using low carbon fuels, and that that's where they could make the economics work. You know, when you look at other countries, there have been different legal setups. Apparently the big thing in Norway was a tax incentive for not releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's what got the Norwegians into this back in the 90s. And according to things I was told 20 years ago, that was paying for the project, just for the tax incentives that they were getting. So they were very happy with it and willing to go on doing it. They've almost been 30 years operating that project.